Welcome to the Free Cities podcast. My name is Timothy Allen, and this is the official podcast of the Free Cities Foundation. Welcome to episode number 4 of the podcast. I'm in El Salvador this week talking with Libertarian, Austrian economist and Bitcoiner Stephan Livera. Now, Stephan was a speaker at the Free Cities Foundation conference Liberty in Our Lifetime, which was held in Prague in October. And afterwards he wrote an excellent article for Bitcoin magazine pointing out the striking parallelism between the Bitcoin movement and the Free Cities movement. As you will see, Stephan is a natural advocate for free cities. He recently voted with his feet, as we say, and left his home country of Australia to move to Dubai, and we discussed the rationale behind this in detail in this conversation. We also talk in depth about the pandemic and consequent lockdowns, and the importance in this day and age of what Stephan calls flag theory. The idea of insulating oneself against unfriendly governments by establishing homes in multiple jurisdictions around the world. Stephan's case for Bitcoin is highly compelling, and he sees it as humanity's best shot at creating real and long-lasting liberty on Earth. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and I'm sure you will too. So it just leaves me to say, sit back, relax, and please enjoy my conversation with Stephan Livera. Welcome, Stephan. Many of our listeners won't know you because you're very well known in the Bitcoin community and possibly the Libertarian community, I would say. But for those people that don't know who you are, can you give us a little bit of background?
Sure. So thank you for inviting me. And yeah, my name's Stephan Livera. I am mostly known for my Bitcoin and Austrian economics focused podcast. It's a self-titled show. I also work at Swan Bitcoin. But in terms of who I am and where I sort of came from, I have been a long-time libertarian since about 14 or 15 years old. I was into liberty-minded aspects of the world and also libertarian economics, and I found Austrian economics. And so I came from that world and then stumbled across Bitcoin, and once it was explained to me the right way, then that just became, that was just a massive tool for me because it was a massive... it gave so much more hope to me because up until then I thought, there's not really that much hope for liberty in our lifetimes. Yeah, we can try to convince people about liberty and libertarianism, but the reality is very few people, it's not a very electorally popular strategy, right? Because you're teaching this message of personal responsibility. You're saying, no, the state should not do that. No, the state should not regulate this. Taxes are wrong. We should minimize them or eliminate them if possible. So it's just a hard message to sell, just fundamentally to the average person. And so, yeah, go on.
Just out of interest, how did you know you were a libertarian at 14? That's interesting. Is it something you consciously thought, or did you just rebel from your parents, let's say?
So, I mean, to be clear, like for me, it was more like my first exposure to Mises' daily articles back then. It was via some IRC channels. So I was in a politics channel, an Australian politics channel, and this guy kept linking to Mises' daily articles. Nowadays, I think it's called Mises Wire, but basically it's their short articles. And so that was my first exposure to Austrian economics, libertarian thought. And at the first time, at the start, I thought, this is crazy. Wouldn't there be gangs like roaming in the, all the standard questions that you ask. And then over the next few years, I started to see, this actually makes a lot more sense than what they're teaching me at school. The high school economics, high school business studies, legal studies, all these things that they were teaching at school, the Austrian economists and libertarians just made so much more sense to me. And so over those few years, I became a libertarian. And so I would say by the time I got to, I would say I had that first exposure around 14 or 15. By the time I got to about 16 or 17, I would have considered myself a libertarian. And then probably by about 18 or 19, I was into anarcho-capitalism. So I thought, yes, ideologically or theoretically, this would be the best thing. Now, do I believe it's going to happen in my lifetime? Maybe not. But, if you ask me what would be the best we can reasonably do, I think the anarcho-capitalist system is the best.
So does that mean that your family were particularly interested in those kind of things to be influenced at that younger age? I mean, my mum didn't tell me anything about libertarianism when I was 14. I started discovering those kind of things when I got to university. There was no talk about it at all. So.
Yeah, so for me, I mean, I didn't really try to proselytize to my family about it. I mean, a little bit, but I would say my parents were slightly right-leaning, but they're not like out-and-out libertarian people, but I would say they were slightly right-leaning.
But I mean, even just talking about politics at that age, or thinking about political theory or ideologies or whatever, how come that was something you were exposed to? Is there something to do with Australia?
I don't know. I mean, I guess I just, for whatever reason, I just was interested to chat about some of those ideas and stumbled across libertarianism and the Mises Institute and things like this. And so then, yeah, basically it just, but at the same time, I thought I was alone. Because to put the context, I grew up in Sydney, Australia, thinking, oh, I'm probably one of the only ones around here, so I'm just on my own out here, right? And so I saw some of these quote-unquote civil libertarian groups, and you might hear a mention of them in the news, but they tended to be more like left's libertarian sort of, or sort of libertarian, but more civil rights, not from that, let's say, that Austro-libertarian private property rights view. So, yeah, so in my mind, I thought I was on my own. And then when the Ron Paul campaign of 2008 happened, I think that was when we saw a bit of a resurgence. And so I was sort of like, oh, actually, maybe there are some other people who think a bit like me. And I knew, of course, in America, there were people like me. But in Australia, I thought, oh, well, I'm kind of on my own out here. Now, I did later stumble across other Australian libertarians, and then I got connected to the Australian libertarian scene. But yeah, for a while, I just thought I was on my own.
So that no one's in the dark, just in case, can you explain to us what anarcho-capitalism means for you? I think a lot of people might be quite scared by the word anarcho.
Right, and so anarcho-capitalism basically means a fully free market, fully privatized everything, and that means even privatized law, private courts, private roads, of course, private security, private national defense, or even if the concept of national defense doesn't quite make sense, but you get the rough idea, territorial defense, let's say. And it's basically that recognition that if the market is better at creating food or cars, then why do we need the state to produce law and to produce those outcomes? And for me, this view of anarcho-capitalism is not a utopian one. It's not saying, oh, the world is going to be hunky-dory and it's this Pollyanna-ish view. No, there will still be murderers and rapists and thieves and everything. It's just that it'll be less bad, right? That's how I think of it, right? It's going to be imperfect, but it'll be better than what we have now. Now, to be clear, do I think we're ever going there in our lifetimes? Maybe not. But the best we can probably achieve is something like this whole free private cities idea, or something like this idea of people who engage in flag theory, people who, of course, use Bitcoin as a parallel financial system. I think some of these ideas are interesting to me, and that's, of course, where we met through all of the free private cities movement and conferences and things. I think that is, in practice, that's where the rubber meets the road. That's actually going to drive a more free society.
Can you remember when your first touch point with Free Cities was, or the Free Cities Foundation? Because you were a speaker at Liberty in Our Lifetime this year.
So my first exposure, I think one of my followers might have DM'd me saying, "Hey, you need to check out this Titus Gable's book," and that was when I read Free Private Cities. So his book about this whole topic, and I interviewed him back. This is maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I interviewed Titus on my show, and this is like episode, I can't remember the exact number, maybe 161, 163, around there. And at that point, I saw it because, so for those people who don't know, in the Bitcoin world, there's this meme of Bitcoin citadels, right? Now, it came from an early Reddit post, I believe in 2013 or 14, and it was a bit of a dystopian vision. So the vision at that point was something like, Bitcoin has taken over, but actually every well-known wealthy Bitcoiner is being hunted down, and therefore they need to go into these citadels to protect themselves, and otherwise, you're stuck out in the wastelands. And it's kind of like that movie Judge Dredd, where there are people out in the wastelands, and you're either out in the wastelands or you're in the nice big city. And so that was where this Citadel meme came from. And so I started signing off my podcast as a bit of a joke, as like hey, I'll see you in the Citadels. And so everyone has their own view of what is a Citadel, right? But I had that idea, and I thought, hey, actually, this free private cities thing is it's almost like very related to this idea of a Bitcoin Citadel. So then I had this idea, let me get Titus on the show and talk to him about it, and let's have a chat and discuss this idea. Are free private cities, are they like a Bitcoin Citadel? And now I know even in the free private cities movement, people like Rahim talk about this, and obviously Titus talks about this, and there are people talking about this kind of idea. Is there a relation? Is there a connection here? Is it a similar audience, let's say?
So go on then, tell me what your version of a Citadel is. Forget anything you knew from the free private cities lot. When you envisage the future under a Bitcoin standard, let's say, what is a Bitcoin Citadel? Or what is a Citadel?
Yeah, I would say the typical way most people are thinking about it is this idea. It's like privately owned land, a privately owned small city, small state, and basically it's the Citadel owner's rules. You opt into those when you go into the city, and it's his responsibility to provide some level of security for that state. And maybe he provides basic services and you pay him a small amount, but it's more like a fee for service. And then, that situation gives you a little bit better rights, or at least economic and other freedom. And so it's a way to, let's say, shield yourself from the broader fiat world. This kind of the rough idea. And so, yeah, you can sort of see there are some parallels there with the free private cities people.
You're, I suppose, quite an interesting case for me specifically, because you have actually moved to Dubai from Australia.
Yeah.
Which I suppose, what's your experience in Dubai then compared to where you came from, and also the reasons why you moved to Dubai? Are they playing out in real time for you? Are they working for you?
So, firstly, yes, I'm enjoying it in Dubai. My wife and I are there, and we are having a great time. I think 2020 changed a lot of things for me. So if you had asked me this question 2019, I would have said, oh, Tim, I'm probably going to die in Australia. I'm probably just going to live in Australia, and that's, I'm just going to do everything there, right? Because while I was born in Sri Lanka, I went to Australia when I was 2 years old, and I was raised there. So I just, for all intents and purposes, I was an Australian who was just going to live and, die in Australia. 2020 really changed all of that, because then it made it a lot more clear to me that, hey, we're paying high taxes. I can't even leave the country. And I'm being stopped from getting involved in my own industry, which is the Bitcoin industry, because they were inviting me for conferences and things, and some of these events were still running, and I was literally trapped inside the country. I was still stuck. And so that was what really shifted my mind, and then made me think, you know what, maybe I should turn my eye elsewhere. And I think what happens for a lot of people is they get stuck in inertia, right? And I can understand this too, because if you have your family and your friends all in one area, it becomes difficult to leave. And so I think it took the hysteria of 2020 to force me to have that internal discussion and have that internal argument. Actually, is Australia the best place for me going forward? And here's the other point I want to add. I think a lot of people look at other places in the world like they're 30 or 40 years ago, right? That they don't have decent infrastructure, at least in the large cities, even in the poorer countries. If you are in the larger cities, more or less, you can get good infrastructure, right? You can have, your running water, and you can have your high-speed internet, and you can have various things that you come to expect. And I think a lot of people have this idea that, the quality of life there is bad or whatever. For us, I was, traveling around for a little bit, but I think Dubai was the best choice for us because of low taxes. So 0 personal income tax there in Dubai. And depending on your company structure, you can either be paying 0 or I think 9% if you have a mainland corporation there. And so it's a massive, massive win. And here's the other thing. So for those people who, if you're a liberty-minded person listening, you might have read the book The Sovereign Individual. Now, I'm going to butcher the statistic, but basically there's a stat where they point out, based on the compound interest, if you save $5,000 every year in tax payment, compounded over 30 or 40 years, it works out to like $10 million for every 5,000. It's just some ridiculous number of money. And it made me realize, well, hang on, here I am in my early, now mid-30s. If I get out and save this money in terms of tax savings, by the time I'm 60 or 70, it's a massive saving. And I could direct those funds into other things that I believe in, other things I care about. And could I still have a good quality of life? Yeah, I could. And I think it's important to take ourselves out of this idea of home country bias. And people do this in an investing sense too, because just think about right now, if you're invested into various ETFs, a common thing people do is they bias to their home country. So for example, if you're in Australia, it's a common thing that you might be biased 30% or something in terms of Australian equities. Now, what percentage of the Australian equity market is the global stock market? Actually, it's like 2 or 3%. But Australians are invested like 30%. So you get this concept of home country bias applies in so many ways. And I was already used to thinking about that from a personal finance and investing perspective, because I would be reading books and these people, finance guys, would be saying, hey, hang on, think about this home country bias idea. And so the same kind of idea applies to where you live. And of course, where we're talking about now, it kind of goes down this flag theory direction, right? What other places could I go, either for a residence or potentially a citizenship or potentially a business setup or set up a bank account or have a property or all these things that you could potentially be doing. And so 2020 was that year where I was basically doing that research and thinking, okay, I need my escape plan, right? I need a way to get out of here because I can't take this anymore.
What something that occurred to me, because I did a Citadel hunt myself with my family. We left Wales, where I'm from, during the pandemic, and we ended up a year on the road. We came to Mexico, El Salvador, America, went to a few places. What I discovered in the end was that my wife found it very difficult to leave home, and as a result, we've ended up back at home. Is that something you have had any difficulties with? And if so, how did you persuade your wife that moving to Dubai was the right thing?
Well, so I think maybe my circumstances are a little bit different because I met my wife while I had left Australia, and part of when I was talking to her, just to make sure that she was on the same page, I was saying, look, I'd love to get with you, but you need to be comfortable with us potentially traveling around. Right. And so I guess part of that was it was part of the upfront way we spoke about it. So look, I think maybe there are certain circumstances that made it work for me. So part of that is also that Sri Lanka right now is going through a hard time, that there's not a lot of economic opportunity. So a lot of people who are younger, let's say millennials and Gen Z, if they can get out, they're trying to get out because there's just not a lot of economic opportunity there. So it's sort of understood that, if you need to go overseas to make money, do that because there's not a lot of opportunity there in the island. So I think that also helped in a way, just the circumstances. Now, of course, your family life and your circumstances are different from mine. I don't have kids yet. I've got a kid on the way though. But so basically we chose Dubai for a few reasons, right? Low tax, good location in terms of easy to travel to Sri Lanka, good infrastructure, safetyness. Dubai is probably in the top 5 cities safety worldwide. I think Abu Dhabi is basically top, and I think Dubai is one of the safest cities literally on earth that you can walk around at night and not be so worried about getting mugged or things like this. So these were some of the factors in our mind, and I think also that there were other Bitcoiners there as well. So we have our Bitcoiner community there. And so I think that helped us automatically find a friends group and automatically have our little community. So, wherever you go, I think people want to find some kind of community, at least where they share ideas and at least mostly see eye to eye on things. So I think those are some of the aspects about Dubai that made it make sense for us.
Something I learnt from talking to the Free Cities people all over the place is that this whole idea of the Citadel is on a spectrum. From at one end you find the sort of tax-free zones, and at the other end we've found, at least, because we've just come from Honduras, there's a place called Prospera there, and that appears to be, in my eyes, the most advanced version of what you would call a free city that there is, that's actually being built. And, it's got buildings going up. There are legislations. They've created their own governance model. They've got permission, let's say, from the Honduran government. Can you see anything in Dubai that you would say, could benefit from sort of moving a little bit further along the spectrum, or is Dubai good as far as you're concerned on their governance model?
Yeah, good question. I think Dubai seems to be liberalizing a little bit over the years. So even recently, now not an issue obviously because I'm married to my wife, but a few years ago there was a law about not sharing a home or even a bed with somebody who you're not related to or married to. So that's an obvious example where if you were a single person trying to date, now I heard they were basically, it's kind of like people did it anyway and they just kind of tried to stay under the radar so that they didn't get in trouble with the law. But recently they changed that. So there's certain aspects of Dubai, they are liberalizing. They are trying to make it a little bit easier. But at the same time, there are certain, aspects you have to accept, right? So the weather, right? It's very hot in Dubai. And especially in that, let's say, April to September time of year, it gets really hot. There's not a lot of green nature stuff. Like, they are trying to work on that too. But I mean, if you like beaches, there's plenty of those. But in terms of people who, if you're the kind of person who needs to go hiking and do this kind of stuff, it might not be the best place. Or maybe you need to fly around for that or fly somewhere else, right? And, take some of your tax savings and fly somewhere and go do your stuff there and then come back. And so you can sort of think of it like, you do have to make certain trade-offs, I think. And in fairness, I think there's something to small states and small cities that perhaps there's a better chance for them to be a good place to set up, whether it's Singapore or, historically Hong Kong before the CCP encroachment. I just think some of these places, it's not a guarantee that they do well, but there's a better chance, there's a better likelihood that with good leadership, as I believe Dubai has, for the most part, had. I think that's why Dubai has come up so quickly and even today represents a very high standard of living if you want it at arguably a cheaper cost, right? So as an example, and you can even objectively look at the numbers. So for yourself or anyone listening, you can look at this website called Numbeo, Numbeo, and they've got a cost of living index. And as an example, I think they index New York to 100. So basically, if you know how costly it is to live in New York City, that's 100. And then there are certain cities like maybe Zurich or things like that are even more expensive than New York. And then Dubai is somewhere in like maybe 67 or something like this. So it's cheaper. Obviously, it doesn't have the same history or the same aspects of like New York, obviously. But you can, and then you add on the layer of paying zero personal income tax. You're earning more, you're spending less. It's just a massive thing economically. So I think that's another aspect that even if you're coming back to family, you might decide, hey, you know what? Especially if you're earning enough, I'd rather fly my family to come visit me and do it like that. So I think there are ways to get around or mitigate some of these aspects, but it is very person by person dependent.
Up until the pandemic, I used to travel to the UAE twice a year. I had a scholarship in Sharjah, which is next to, and my overall feeling of the Middle East is I would struggle to live there on account of the environment. And I do like it, and I love. I mean, it's an unbelievably luxurious place. It's really quite astonishing how luxurious it is. If it, for certain people, let's say. But yeah, for me, I would need greenery. I would need those kind of things. I'm wondering whether you had set your sights on any other places before you landed on Dubai.
So I was looking at low tax places. Obviously, I was thinking, what about maybe like Isle of Man, or maybe in the Caribbean somewhere, or places like this. So I was thinking about some of those, or even places in Asia. Like potentially there are ways people might look at structuring their income in certain ways. That, as an example, if you have your income is in a business and it's outside of the country and you don't bring that income into the country, then there are certain rules and aspects. But I thought, the simplest way is to just go somewhere with zero personal income tax, and then just because it allows you a certain level of simplicity. So that's why Dubai, just because of the simplicity of that and relative low cost of getting your foot in the door in terms of a residency or some kind of setting up a business or things like this. So
was it easy? Yeah. Is it easy to get residency in Dubai?
I would say relatively. There are different pathways, obviously. So one is freelancer, another one is set up a company, and another one is buy a property. So they have like a golden visa program if you buy a property above a certain value. And I think they have different tiers of that. So I would say if you just want the cheapest way in, probably looking at like a freelancer pass or permit via some of the different organizations that offer that. And you can find, based on your occupation and what you're doing, you can set up using a freelancer permit and have your wife as a dependent or your spouse as a dependent. And then that's one way. Another way is, set up a company. And that might be, I can't recall the exact numbers, but let's say if you're setting up a company, it might be anywhere from like $10,000 to $30,000. And you are paying a licensing fee, because that's part of how Dubai has low tax, right? So you're paying a licensing fee instead of a corporate tax. Although coming soon, if you're a mainland corporation, to be clear, there is going to be a 9% tax. I think it's above about 100,000 USD, something like that. These are just rough numbers, right? But yeah, you get the idea. So there are cheaper ways to get in the door.
Out of interest, what's the Bitcoin scene like in Dubai? And are the government on board with the notion of Bitcoin?
I would say I don't like the quote unquote crypto. There's a bit of a crypto scene. So there's a lot of shitcoin people there in Dubai, just in general. There is a growing Bitcoin scene also. So I recently became an organizer of Bitcoin Dubai. I was an organizer of Bitcoin Sydney back when I was there, which is just a meetup group, and we try to teach people about Bitcoin and all the typical things. So
how many people are coming along to those kind of meetups then?
So anywhere from like 50 to 150. Like in a bull, if it's kind of a bullish season, we might get more, 150 to 200, and in a bear, maybe 50 to 100.
Were you there? Have you just come from Dubai now? Because I'm just interested to know how the sentiment is currently in the crypto scene.
Yeah, I was just in LA for Pacific Bitcoin, but prior to that, I was in Dubai and we had a meetup, and there was probably about 50, 60 people in a bear cycle meetup. And so we'll see what we can do about growing that even in a bear. I think there are some reasons to be bullish though. So for example, one of the members of the ruling family of Dubai, his investment group or family office is called Seed Group. And you might have seen they recently did a deal with Coin Corner from Isle of Man to do a Bitcoin. Basically, it seems like they want to do Bitcoin and Lightning payments across their investments, starting in Dubai, because obviously he's from Dubai. So he has some investments and they want to do Bitcoin and Lightning. So if one of the members of the ruling family is doing Bitcoin payments, I think it's a good indicator for where they see things. Now, it may be a little bit of a crypto and blockchain sort of scene as opposed to Bitcoin only, but you have to start somewhere, and we'll see. And I think it has a lot of the conditions that make sense. So for example, there's no capital gains tax in Dubai. So that's another big factor, right? Because if you have no capital gains tax, then it's a lot easier to do spending and receiving and things like this without crazy complicated accounting.
You were a speaker at Liberty in Our Lifetime, which was the Free City Foundation's conference recently. And you wrote a great article in Bitcoin Magazine all about it. I'm going to read out the title here because even the title is great. Finding Liberty in Parallel, Bitcoin and the Free Cities Movement. So you obviously see a strong correlation between Bitcoin and the Free Cities ethos. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? And maybe start by talking about your experience at the conference. What was your overall experience of coming to Prague?
I thought it was great. I enjoy going to Prague, and it was a really interesting mix because it wasn't only a Bitcoin conference, it was a mix of things. You had people speaking about the philosophy and the theory of some of these aspects. We had people talking about seasteading. We had people talking about Bitcoin. We had people talking about flag theory. We had people talking about intentional communities and just all of these different ways. But I really liked that the theme was about parallel structures. and I definitely made that the theme of my talk, and even it probably comes through in the article also, is this idea of just building out parallel structures that they can't stop. And that's where obviously Bitcoin comes in. That's where, and so many of the other ideas came in. And I think what made it interesting, the conference interesting, was just that it was a broad church of people who, if you asked them, they probably agreed maybe 80 to 90% of their worldviews were aligned. Now, yes, there were some things around the edges, maybe some would disagree in that, but for the most part, it was mostly libertarians and liberty-minded people, all with their own angle of how to do things or how to push things forward. So that was what was interesting to me. I certainly see a lot of synergy between Bitcoin and the Free Cities movement. I think, for example, it's a common thing where they will try to shut you down from a fiat perspective. So whether that's PayPal or whether that is Visa, MasterCard, or whether that is the standard fiat banks or FATF and OECD and these kinds of organizations who try to say, look, you're trying to set up some new thing, we're going to graylist you, or we're going to blacklist you and stop anyone else from transacting with you. And obviously, with Bitcoin fixes this. You can transact with Bitcoin without having to ask permission. You can set up a wallet on your phone today, and I can transact to you right now with relatively low fees and relative ease. So Bitcoin is a natural fit here, because if you're trying to set up a free private city and the banking system or the fiat legacy banking system doesn't want to let you, you can say, you know what, I don't need you anyway. We're just going to do it with Bitcoin. And so I think that's an obvious tie-in there. Obviously, I know with Prospera, one of the gentlemen from Prospera mentioned Bitcoin is a legal tender, or think of it like a de facto legal tender. It's not the only one. They just have no capital gains tax, so you can do whatever. That's probably the main aspect of it. And I think it also, even if you're not going to go set up in a free private city, setting up and taking Bitcoin as payment allows you to do this kind of parallel society, this kind of secret society that you could just set up online. It doesn't matter whether you're in America or Zimbabwe or Sri Lanka. You could set up and have your website service selling products, information products, or selling your services, and just use software such as BTC Pay Server, which allows you to be your own payment processor. And so I just see a natural tie-in and a crossover there.
It's funny, I think a lot of Bitcoiners are starting to understand that the path to adoption is just that. It's not about Bukele making Bitcoin legal tender in his country. It's actually about people just accepting it, spending it, and taking it, and having these parallel sort of societies, financial societies, just arising. That's certainly been my experience in orange pilling people. The easiest way to orange pill people is to, if they're offering a service, is just to say, okay, accept Bitcoin. And then two things happen. Number one is it's easy. And number two is a market opens up to them of Bitcoiners that they didn't even know existed. And it's an astonishing and great thing to see. I wonder, from your time at the conference, was there anything you learned there that you didn't know about from the Free Cities movement? Any ideas, concepts, even projects that you didn't know?
Oh, well, I think I had a vague awareness of seasteading, but actually seeing some of the talks from the seasteading guys made it a bit more real in my mind. It made it a bit more feasible. Now, being honest, it's not personally my cup of tea. I wouldn't be the first one to sign up and go live on the sea pod or stay at the sea pod, but it made it a bit more feasible. And it sort of explained, I sort of heard a bit more of the context around how they deal with various objections and how it might actually work. So as I understand, there was, obviously the sea pod and that idea. And then there was this other gentleman, I've forgotten the guy's name, but he was talking about this idea of gradually starting with everyone living on a boat and then slowly moving, and then having this, like, from a theoretical point of view, it's really cool, right? This idea that people can create these platforms out at sea, fully free market, and just merge or disconnect and reconnect whenever and however they choose, such that there's this free market platform out there. And that part is really cool. Now, the parts where you might get a bit more scared are kind of like, well, what if there's like a big issue out there, or what if there's tsunamis, or if there's like hurricanes, or if there's people drowning? Like, how do you now maybe some of the answer here is technology, maybe some of the answer here is economic advancement, all kinds of things. But it at least gave some idea about how it could happen in a gradual step-by-step fashion. And so that was one aspect. I learned a bit more about how the Free State Project worked as well. So obviously, as a libertarian, I knew of the Free State Project, and I spiritually was hoping they would win, hoping they would pull through. I'm not an American, so for me, it didn't really make sense to try to become an American to go move to New Hampshire. But I wanted the Free State Project to win, right? As a libertarian, I wanted them to have some success, and it sounds to me like they've had some success and some failures along the way. And from what I understand, they have this, they've got all these people. They've got all these people have to contribute all this time and effort to that movement. And it may not necessarily bring about libertaria or libertarianism in New Hampshire straight away, just given the size of the population of New Hampshire and the tiny relative number of libertarians. And it takes a lot of activist mindset and a lot of people who are working hard. And for all that work, how much extra liberty would they achieve? And so I think that's why, for me, at the end of it, I think perhaps the flag theorists have probably the best overall answer right now. And the flag theorists were there, people like Katie and Plan B Passport and that other organization, I believe they're called Staten Loss. And so they were, I categorize them as, okay, they're the flag theorist people. And obviously I have, I'm sort of doing some of that too. So I think the flag theory people.
Can you just elaborate on flag theory, just in case someone doesn't know what you mean?
Yeah, sure. So the basic idea is, for most people, right, by default, you're born in a certain country, you are a citizen of that country, you are a resident of that country, your tax residency is there, all your bank accounts are there, you live there, you die there, you're married there, you have your kids there, everything there. Flag theory is more like this idea of disassociating those things, that maybe you live in one country, but you have a citizenship from another. You maybe have a tax residence somewhere else. Maybe your business is set up somewhere else. Maybe you're using a phone number from somewhere else. Maybe you have your banking and your credit card somewhere else, or you're using Bitcoin. It's this idea of disassociating those things. And as I see it, you are selecting the best in the world instead of just living through life as a passenger of the accident of our birth. Where we were born does not have to be where we die. Where we were born does not have to be where we live, does not have to be where we pay taxes, except if you're an American. Okay, that's a different story. But that's the basic idea. Flag theory is this idea that you can select better jurisdictions. And so I guess one last idea I would convey there is this idea of geo-arbitrage. So that's this idea that you could go set up either in a low tax or a low cost of living place or country, but earn a higher income, like a US dollar or a Bitcoin income from somewhere else. And so I think that's one of the key ideas, is that by using flag theory, you can execute this idea of geo-arbitrage. I would say that's the high-level way I'm thinking of it.
If we're talking about flag theory, I suppose we've got to talk about the pandemic, because arguably the measures that most countries implemented during the pandemic potentially put a stop to flag theory. Have you got an opinion on that? Is that it's a bit the elephant in the room, really? What happens when people can't cross borders, or what happens when you're blacklisted, or what happens when Europe's running on a CBDC and you can't move from where you live? So
I think that's also part of the answer of why it's important to have your backup option before these things go wrong. So just like why you should hold some Bitcoin before the financial collapses and before these things go wrong, you wanna think about, should I have a residency somewhere else? Should I even have a passport from somewhere else? And so as an example, if your home country's passport is blocking you from travel, do you have an alternate passport? And historically, a lot of people might have been eligible for even a passport through their legacy or through their family tree, basically, to in Europe and other places where they allow you to do this. So they often did not go through the bureaucracy to get it. But then from post 2020, everyone can understand why it might well have been worth your while to go and get those extra passports that you can, because that gives you another option. Instead of being stuck, now you have another choice. So it's not perfect. There is no perfect, but it might make it better for you, or it might lessen the impact of travel restrictions in that case.
As a libertarian, what's your view on passports in general? Because they're a relatively new invention, historically speaking.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, what is it, like 120, 130 years ago, they didn't even really exist, right? And just like many government projects, I'm sure they said, oh, it's only a temporary thing. And then all of a sudden now that's the new reality we live in. And so it's unfortunate, but I see it like if it enables you to do the whole flag theory thing, if that flag theory thing enables you to pay less taxes, isn't it a net win? Is that not a net win for you and your family, and even to the broader liberty movement? Are you not denying tax money to the state? Now, I'm saying do it legally, right? Of course, I'm a public name, so I can't be out here telling people, yeah, evade taxes. I have no moral opposition to that. I have a strategic opposition, right? I think taxes are theft, typical libertarian arguments. I just think from a strategic point of view, if you're a public name, you're better off trying to do things legally so that you legally exit the tax system of your current country and go somewhere with a better tax situation. And in doing so, aren't you denying your funding to the big welfare and warfare state? That's how they make these things. That's how they pay for the guns and the warfare and all the restrictions. So doing this and pursuing this kind of strategy is aligned with libertarian thought, in my view.
So if tax is theft, then how does a Citadel operate in your mind?
Upfront fee for service, just like free private cities. It's this idea that, hey, you're here, you pay for these services, we pay, we provide you X, Y, and Z, you pay us this much, that's that. And I think part of it is also this mindset of encouraging people not to just be a default passenger along life and actually be more intentional about where they live, why they live there, and how long they stay there. Because that, in a way, helps stop the abuse and the corruption that happens in some of these bigger states. I think what happens is there's a certain inertia to these things. And because of that inertia, people just stay where they are, and it becomes like that story of the frog in the boiling pot that everybody knows. They just stay and they become a frog in a boiling pot rather than being intentional and saying, hey, I don't have to be here. I could just leave.
Absolutely. I'll go back to one of the points I made earlier, and because I've experienced this firsthand. When you have a family and roots and immediate family around you, it's very difficult to up sticks like that. We're living in interesting times. I spent 6 weeks here in El Salvador at the beginning of the year, and I met a lot of refugees here from Canada, ironically, who had left Canada on account of not wanting to take the vaccination. They were ostracized, so they had to get out, and a lot of them came to Mexico, but the Bitcoiners came here, and some very good friends of ours are still here now. Another interesting story in Prague, we met educational refugees from Sweden, who moved to Prague because it's illegal to homeschool in Sweden. These are strange times we're living in. Do you have an opinion on the trajectory that we're currently on? This kind of move towards further authoritarianism. Is that something you see in yourself, and is it something that has a natural end to it?
I see it like there are life cycles to these things in a way that sometimes it's like, the microcosm might be, let's say there's a really cool restaurant or bar and nobody knows about it, and it's really cool and, really great value and best food or whatever, and you go there and eventually it starts to become like everyone goes there, everyone knows that place, and then eventually it's sort of the bad side of the life cycle is, now it's overpriced and it's not that great, and maybe the chef has lost the inspiration and the zeal, or maybe they've got new management now. It wasn't the same chef or the same manager. The same cycle can happen with countries. And so I think what we're really doing is we're looking out at the world and realizing, actually, I think places like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, they're sort of, I wouldn't say going down because they're all going to explode or whatever. I just say they're going to stagnate a bit, relatively. And I think I view them as relatively stagnating because of all the bad decisions they've made over the last few years. Meanwhile, there are other countries that were relatively open. There are other countries that are arguably hungrier and therefore offering a better deal to people, lower taxes, better freedom, etc. And so it's a matter of choosing, your place where you go. Now, yes, you do make trade-offs, right? From a family point of view, or if you are thinking about going nomad, well, okay, it might be harder to do that with pets, as an example. So maybe you don't have pets, and that's a trade-off you make. But it gives you more overall freedom and in what's important to you in terms of low taxes or whatever other things are important to you. So, yes, we are moving through a time when authoritarianism is running rampant. I think part of that is also just people have become complacent and just very docile. They've had a lot of the resistance to tyranny beaten out of them, and now they just go along with what they're told. They just do what they're told. And you see this in China with lockdowns still, right? There are cities in China that are still in lockdown. So it's kind of crazy that that's still happening. But I think what happened for a lot of people is they sort of took this idea of, oh, you can do whatever you want to me as long as you make me rich kind of thing. It's almost like there was this quote-unquote grand bargain that arguably in China happened. I mean, you could even argue that happened around the world, right? That a lot of people just said, yeah, you can do whatever you want to me, just help me get richer or whatever. And then they didn't care about actual freedom. Now, there's no one perfect place to go that has all the perfect freedom and all the, et cetera. But I just think the point is look outside and think, well, actually, how could I move elsewhere? That said, it's not for everyone. Like, I understand that, but I think I was lucky in a way because in terms of my family moving to Australia when I was young, it was mom, dad, and my little sister, and that was it. I didn't really have any extended family in Australia. So you could also argue, hey, you know what, Stephan, that made it easier for you because you don't have a lot of extended family in Australia. So, but by the same token, though, you could still do that thing that I was saying. You could go set up somewhere else that's lower tax, lower cost, something, and then, fly them, with that tax saving you make, fly them over to you.
I'm personally, during the pandemic, I was watching Australia with rather a gobsmacked look at the procedures that were happening. The the government seemed to be being very authoritarian. Was that what it looked like from the inside?
Oh, massively. Yeah, I mean, they were literally stopping people from organizing a Facebook group. There was this pregnant mother not in Melbourne, but in a region a little further outside of Melbourne, and she was organizing a protest, anti-lockdown protest, in an area with a lower level of lockdown than Melbourne at the time. And she organized this Facebook group, and this is famous. This was on like the news and Twitter and everything. The police literally came in and she was pregnant and in her pajamas, and they're arresting her, and she had her ultrasound in like an hour, right? This is the kind of crazy stuff that was going on in Australia. Unfortunately, the old perception of Australia being this nation of tough men like a Paul Hogan and Steve Irwin, that is gone as far as I'm concerned. I think they all rolled over. 80% of the country just rolled over and took it, basically. There were so few people speaking out against the scam, and only now are we starting to see people start to come out and awake from their slumber, but I think it's too little too late, sadly.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think that... I mean, would Paul Hogan want to do what the government does, or would he rebel? Is he that kind of a guy?
Well, I know he did get into a tax battle with them, so maybe
right.
he would. So they did take him to court for about a tax battle. I don't know the details, so I'm not saying who was right, who was wrong.
I suppose what I'm trying to get at is, most people kind of look fondly upon their own government. I think that's been my experience. I was the same.
They identify collectively with the government. This idea of we, right?
Right.
That's what they think.
But when I forget who it was, one of the politicians, I can't remember, is it Dan somebody in Australia? I don't know.
Dan Andrews.
Right. He was a really nasty guy. Oh, yeah. It seemed horrible. Like. Yeah. How are people looking at him and going, everything's okay? For example, because most people are, by the looks of it.
Dan Andrews is a horrible, horrible man. He has all of these sycophants on social media and these little woke lefty people who just love his every move. And so I think what happened is a lot of people were just docile and unfortunately not willing to critically think or question much of anything. And so they just bought the line. And so they believed the lie, this idea that, everyone has to get vaccinated to protect everyone else and da-da-da. And they sort of successfully framed it in that way. Now, to be clear, they had a lot of money going their way. There were even, and this was around the world, right? I know even in Canada this happened, where media organizations took government bailout money. It's hard to bite the hand that feeds. That's just the fundamental truth of it, right? It's hard for them to then now critically turn back and question their government when they're taking money from that same government. So I think that was part of it. And I think there was a culture in Australia, at least amongst mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream media, where they didn't want to lose access to the Prime Minister, the premiers of the states, and the high-level people. And so if they were too challenging in their questioning, they probably in the back of their mind know, oh, I won't get to talk to this guy anymore, and then I'll be shut out, and all my colleagues will win the story, and then I won't get, the story. So maybe that was part of what was going in their mind. Part of it, I think, is just they fundamentally were trusting and not verifying. And this is like a thing in the Bitcoin community, this idea of don't trust, verify. Now, it depends what level you take it to, but fundamentally, a lot of people were just sort of rubber stamping things. They were just not really critically questioning, why are you locking down when lockdown, quote unquote, was never a thing in any of the pre-2019 pandemic planning. They had pandemic plans. Lockdown was never a part of them. There was never this idea that you should lock down the healthy people. It was crazy. It was absolute, utterly mad. And unfortunately, the media and the social media of the platforms had stifled, they suppressed anybody who was anti that. And, those of us who were trying to speak out against it were suppressed, and we paid a big social price. I mean, I arguably paid a big social price too. I was speaking out against lockdowns in late March 2020. Right? So I was saying, no, guys, stop the hysteria, right? And I was posting on Facebook to try to at least stop the hysteria amongst my Facebook friends. But I copped so much heat for that. A lot of people thought I was a grandma killer and I was a crazy conspiracy theorist and, you're just being selfish, or you're trying to put profit ahead of people, the typical sort of woke idiot lines. And so that was part of my decision as well. I just thought, you know what? It's not just about the government. It's also about the culture of the place you live. If the culture of the place you live is on the way down, you can be sure that the government is going to do that too. Because, hey, quote unquote, it's collective. It's we chose to do all this stuff. So,
do you think that lockdowns could ever happen again?
Good question. I think probably yes. I think sadly yes. Obviously I don't like that, but I think if they whip the public up into enough fear, they'll accept whatever. It's like that saying, "Don't let a crisis go to waste." I think sadly we're stuck in that world. So those of us who are freedom and liberty minded have to do what's necessary to protect ourselves. And if that means having other alternatives, plan B this, plan B that, yeah, it's costly too, right? It's not free to do these things, but is the cost worth it above a certain level of net worth, certain level of income? Yeah, probably.
You mentioned this in your article for Bitcoin Magazine, that the large elephant in the room with regards to many of these things is the government. And even in the Bitcoin world, one of the main questions you get asked from people that don't know much about it is, well, what if the government stops it? With free cities and these kind of things, it's probably more relevant. I mean, we both know you can't stop Bitcoin. So that question's off the table. You can do a lot of things to it, but you can't stop it. With free cities and this idea, it's more possible, I would imagine, to put a stop to those kind of things. Is that anything you spoke to anyone about at the conference, or you have any ideas on that?
I mean, I'm sure the standard answers are this idea that you have a third-party court outside of that jurisdiction. You might, be able to get some kind of recourse in that way. Like, I understand that's kind of the standard, answer in terms of the free private cities. But that's part of it. I think also it's just driving competitiveness amongst states is also a good thing. So I mentioned in my article as well, I think they're all additive. All of these things help each other because, as an example, the more flag theory people out there doing their flag theory thing, the more competition governments will have to be under. They'll face that competitive pressure. And a good example here would be, look at how many countries around the world now have a digital nomad program. Now, for all the criticism of digital nomads, there are a lot of countries out there deciding, hey, you know what? We need to lean into this. Let's have a digital nomad program where we allow people to come here and spend their money, right? They're spending their money in the local country to give jobs.
Is that an official thing, a digital nomad program? Can you
To be clear, it's not always called that. In some cases, it's called a different thing. But for example, Bali has one.
What is that? What is it then?
Basically, it's like a residence permit. It's a temporary residence permit, normally for 1 or 2 years, based on certain conditions. You might need to show a certain level of income, a certain level of assets, and basically the government is giving you a permit to go and stay there. Now, additionally, in some cases, I understand that some of these countries will even give you low taxes in the time you're there. So they're sort of understanding, hey, you know what if I get some of these high skill workers to come to my country, spend their money at my restaurants and bars and whatever, and so the locals get jobs. Now, they may put certain conditions on these programs to say you're not allowed to take a local job. That's the main thing. They might say, look, Tim, you're allowed to come and stay here, but you may not take a local job. You need to have your income coming from outside, or you have your net worth already from outside and you're just spending here, right? That's more like a retiree case. And then there's kind of the younger, I'm still working and earning, but from outside the country, and I'm spending it here locally.
And are those, I've not heard of those before, are they new things
Relatively.
purely based around the fact that people now do that people take a laptop and go and work anywhere they want?
I would say some of these programs existed pre the digital nomad phenomenon, but now we're seeing more countries acknowledge that reality and also do that and say, hey, we're going to also offer that kind of program because we see the benefit. So it's not a perfect thing again, right? But there are more and more countries. Like if you search digital nomad visa or digital nomad residence on a search engine, you'll probably find at least 20 or 30 programs around the world. Now, like I said, they won't all be called this. They might be called something else. They may be called virtual working program visa or, temporary worker visa or something like this. But a lot of countries have it now. And so this is something that people can be doing as part of their whole flag theory thing as well.
I should ask you this question because you're a Bitcoiner. Do you think free cities can work without Bitcoin in the long run?
Good question. Maybe. But it really depends how the narrative goes, right? So if the narrative is, oh, look, you free private cities, you're enabling, because the narrative will be, oh, look, see, you're enabling all these money launderers and drug criminal terrorists, whatever, they're moving here, we need to shut you down.
Well, funnily enough, that I'm not so sure that's one of the main attack vectors, because in Prospera, it's not been that. It's been Europeans are coming here and buying our land and taking it away from us. That was the
Gotcha.
what the I mean the problem with Prospera is it was the idea of the ZAs, these zones,
that
was
they were selling sovereignty, or they were diminishing the sovereignty of the local country.
Yes, and the government that allowed them to do it, when then lost to the next government. Now the new government is saying, look, that government sold out our nation to these people. That seems to be the main attack vector, which you can understand. It's very easy to
make that argument.
Yes.
And to a very collectivist-minded people, it's easy to make that argument. So certainly that's out there too. And so, I mean, you could say, now, to be fair, against that, in that particular case, you could say, look, Bitcoin didn't really help there, right? Because at that point, it was more about the culture. It was more about the mindset of the people in the country, of Hondurans who maybe believed that idea that, quote unquote, we collectively own this land. It doesn't matter, even if it's going to make us poorer to not have these free private cities set up here or the ZS set up here. We just don't want them. What do you do, right? So let's put it this way. Bitcoin can't hurt you, right? It's not going to hurt you having alternative money, generally speaking. But there are other cultural hurdles and barriers that have to be faced. But you know what? I'm sure it's the same kind of thing that was being fought in terms of slavery abolitionists, right? I'm sure there were people saying, who's gonna pick the cotton, right? Without my slaves, who's gonna, that would be the kind of argument they made. And so it's on libertarians and free private city people to try to push against that and help show actually there's a big benefit to the country. There's a big benefit to the people by having these things.
With regards to Bitcoin adoption in general as well, you've probably spoken to, because you've got such an important Bitcoin podcast, you must have spoken to almost everyone who's connected with anything to do with Bitcoin. As far as adoption goes, what's your overall impression of the toughest hurdle that Bitcoin adoption has to go through? Or has already gone through, possibly?
I think it might just be inertia, right? Like assuming, if I was kind of in my little bubble, I could sort of be like, oh, look, it's KYC, AML laws, or it's this and that. Like, I think fundamentally, it's just inertia. A lot of people don't understand where their money already is right now, right? Their money right now is probably in some retirement account that is invested in government bonds and like random equities that person has no idea about, or maybe it's in some property REIT, some property trust thing. They have no idea. If we could stop that inertia and get more and more people to understand Bitcoin as this parallel system, that would really move the needle massively. Yeah.
I suppose the problem I see then is the same problem we spoke about earlier in Australia and around the world. Most people don't care. I think this is a problem during lockdowns. Most people don't care. Just, all right, lock me down as long as it sorts the problem out. With Bitcoin, all right.
But this comes back to the main idea of Bitcoin and Bitcoiners being this intransigent minority. It's this idea that even Corey Clipston from Swan has spoken about this, and that's kind of like a company mission of Swan, is this idea that we need to grow the base of Bitcoin holders and people who will go and fight for it. Maybe they go and speak at a town hall, or they'll go and teach people about Bitcoin. They'll encourage their family and friends. We need to grow that base of people, and individually in your own little countries you might be small, but globally, summed up, I think it's a force to be reckoned with. And that's this whole idea of growing that parallel economy. So I think that's why I believe Bitcoin is the best shot at liberty. It's the best chance to substantially defund and right-size the government, or at least make it smaller, right? When I say right-size, I mean, of course, ideal would be zero, but let's make it as small as we can. So, Bitcoin, and I think fundamentally what allows these governments to do what they do is cheap debt. So think of it like this, right? If they have a lot of bag holders who are willing to hold government bonds and government currency, that's more bag holders that the government can print and dump on. And so if more people understood the dynamic there and said, hey, you know what? Instead of holding government bags, I'm going to hold Bitcoin. That's going to create a lot less, it's going to start tipping the scales eventually. Once you get enough people, it's going to tip the scales over and make it more difficult for governments to have cheap debt financing, which also means they can't afford these massively authoritarian and big state programs.
What if, though, this is as many Bitcoiners as we're going to get? What if, in the same way that there were a limited number of freedom lovers, obviously, during the pandemic. What I notice about the Bitcoin community is the information signal is very, very pure. We had a lot of information within a few months of the pandemic starting. We had Bitcoiners saying X, Y, Z, which all transpired in the end. What if we're just a minority, and so be it? How do we live?
That's a fair question. And you know what? I think you're right. There is some aspect there where, we have to allow that possibility. I just think fundamentally people are going towards the hardest money over time. And I think that's, like our friend Safety with the Bitcoin Standard, it's this idea that it's the hardest money. People will adopt it, and it's, as Safety says, they're not going to adopt it just like, because it's the iPhone, it's the cool latest new technology. They will adopt it like gunpowder or nuclear weapons or nuclear energy because they have to. Because you just, you need this technology. People who are using this technology are at a massive, massive advantage to people who are not. And so obviously right now, Bitcoin is down in terms of the overall, all-time high, but people who have been long time stacking with Bitcoin and transacting with Bitcoin have done very well. So I think that's where it comes down to. And I think, yes, right now, we're having this, crypto clowns get wiped out, washed out, bankrupt. The fraud is getting exposed, all of that. But that's the new base. And so I understand. And I think what happens is during a bear cycle, people get overly bearish. And during a bull cycle, they get overly bullish. And I think right now it's just people have this very bearish mindset around Bitcoin when fundamentally this is actually this is the time when new Bitcoin maxis and Bitcoiners are being minted. This is the time that people are going to start getting into it. And now they've got a nice low entry point relative to what it was a few years ago or a year ago. And so I think this is like the adoption is going to continue going. I think it's like people not choosing to use the internet or the email. Like email didn't have a bear market, right? Like people just used it because it was a better technology. And I think it's the same thing. With the technology being built out with Bitcoin, we're seeing improvements, things like the Lightning Network being more reliable, faster, and arguably more private over time with new technology coming. So I think it's all getting better. It's actually just a matter of teaching people and trying to find them when they're ready. Because sometimes you talk to somebody and they're just not ready, right? It's like that saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. A lot of the students are just not ready. They haven't had enough pain yet, sadly. I think a lot of people will have to learn through pain. And so whether that's pain coming from inflation or from being shut down, it's coming. And so the task of Bitcoiners is to try to be there and be a helping voice and, try to restrict our little, we told you so sort of aspect of it and be more helpful and constructive and say, okay, yeah, look, sorry for your loss. I know you got wrecked on that shitcoin or in that fiat currency or in the government bond, but here's the alternative. Here's what you can do now. Set up this Bitcoin wallet, learn to run your Bitcoin node, learn to be self-sovereign, and here's some people you can transact with and either earn money or spend money, right? And so even with Swan, we have bitcoinerjobs.com. It's a site where people can go and post up their jobs that they want or apply for jobs. And these are Bitcoiner jobs. So that's one example. So I think it's just trying to grow the ecosystem in whatever way we can and just be ready for them when they get hurt and offer them our better alternative.
You say when they get ready. I think in the end, as authoritarianism grows, in the end, everyone gets on the wrong side of the authoritarians. There's no one left in the end. So arguably, yes. Going back to your point that people would choose the best money over the long term, which we obviously think is Bitcoin, or we know is Bitcoin, I would say. What if they think the best money is a central bank digital currency? It's quite possible.
Look, people could believe it, but over time, we all know where that's going. We know the inflation is coming.
Drill down on that then. I know. Tell me what you know about CBDCs.
Sure. So CBDCs, central bank digital currencies. There's been a lot of talk about this recently in the news, in the social media, etc. Basically, we can think of this as a control coin or surveillance coin controlled by the government. And the funny thing is, people just latch onto things in the same way. In 2015 they said, I don't like Bitcoin but blockchain technology, look how good that is. It's the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of people who are saying, I don't like Bitcoin but CBDCs, I like where that's going, right? And so they have this idea that somehow it's offering it's digital money, not recognizing that the money most people are already using is already digital. It is already numbers on a bank account database somewhere transferring from someone's bank account to the other person's bank account. That's all it is. It's just that with central bank digital currencies, central banks will have a lot more fine-tuned control. They can do things like give you some money that expires in 6 months. So they can do all of their crazy demurrage ideas and say, look, Tim, if you don't spend this $1,000 in 6 months, it disappears. So therefore, I'm quote-unquote stimulating the economy. It will allow all kinds of crazy economic ideas that we know to be dumb, but people will run the experiment and they're going to learn. Now, these kinds of experiments have already been run in the quote-unquote crypto land. There are fork coins of Bitcoin like Frycoin and some of these other coins that have like demurrage or other things attached to them. But more importantly, they will start coding the central bank digital currency or the control coin to only allow expenses on things they want. So as an example, even today, this kind of thing exists in America with, I believe it's called EBT. So it's like a welfare card or money, and that person may only spend that EBT money or dollars at EBT shops. And there's certain things they're not allowed to buy. So it's the same kind of idea, but just expanded to everybody. So these new control coins may stop people and whatever vices or whatever things they want, whatever the state says is not a good thing, whether it's cigarettes or alcohol or whatever, or meat even, right? If they say you've been eating too much meat, or you're not allowed to fly, you plebs, right? They'll say us plebs, we may not fly, but they, the elite, or they, the vultures and the people of society who fly around to Davos forums in their private jets, they're allowed, but us normal people are not allowed to fly, right? That's the kind of thing. So sooner or later, If you haven't been financially cancelled yet, you will be. If you haven't been inflated, you will be. So fundamentally, people will see central bank digital currencies or control coins or surveillance coins going down in value, and they'll see Bitcoin going up. It's an obvious choice, in my view.
If they're programmable, though, presumably you won't be able to, there'll be no on-ramps to Bitcoin from CBDCs. So you won't be able to buy Bitcoin with a CBDC. How do we mitigate that then?
Potentially. I mean, there might be some people who earn and spend it like a shitcoin, right? So they might sort of say, okay, I'm going to, but that's also an indicator of why you got to get out into Bitcoin earlier, right? And so for some people, they may just have to earn Bitcoin directly, right? If they've been trapped inside the control coin system and they need a way out, well, then maybe they've got to leave the country or they've got to start earning in a parallel system, right? They might start doing services and just earn in Bitcoin and spend Bitcoin, because that's the money that you can actually spend. And speaking of Czech Republic and Prague, I know from chatting with some of the Czech people, they were telling us during the communist era, they actually had different money that they needed to go buy good things, right? So they had the money that they could earn, that they could spend on food and certain things, but if they wanted like a nice pair of jeans or things like that, they needed to go and find a different kind of money. And it's the same kind of idea. Bitcoin is going to be that better kind of money that you can buy anything you want with it, whereas with the control coins, you can only buy what the state lets you.
So maybe the CBDC ecosystem and the Bitcoin ecosystem will just live alongside each other then. I mean, I mean, most people say CBDCs are coming. We know how powerful they'll be. They'll probably be combined with some form of UBI to get you hooked on them. Here's some free money, but only if you have it in this wallet. This is how authoritarianism scales. This is how it really scales. In the past we've seen it scale to only a certain point before it collapses. But with CBDCs, I actually feel that this is how ultimate control on a very large scale is implemented. I don't know whether that's something you agree with. If it is, are you positive about the future? How do you see the future unfolding?
So, firstly, I mean, yeah, we're talking about the CBDCs, but in practice, I don't know how feasible it'll be sometime soon, because a lot of the talent doesn't want to work on this kind of thing. They would rather go work on the free stuff, as in the freedom enabling stuff. And so governments will have to wrestle with a lot of this back and forth, right? Because here's the thing, if they want to cut out retail banks, they need to also provide their own customer service and support centers. And it's not a simple thing to just switch on a CBDC, because there'll be someone who lost their password, or someone who, whatever, that they need to reverse a transaction, and they need someone to call, and they need a call center. They need a whole set of infrastructure to do this. And so I don't think it'll just be that simple as just flicking the switch. Yes, there are talks about trials and so on, and they will eventually come. But the opportunity now is to get people into Bitcoin that we can, whoever we can, the ones who are ready.
And well, Bitcoin is already ready. It's a system that's operating already, and it really is ready. Arguably it can still do with a bit of tweaking on the second and third and fourth layers or whatever, but it works. We've been using it for many years already. Between our friends and people that know, it works. So, okay, well, I feel like that's been a phenomenal conversation. I just want to ask you one final question. This is a question we ask all our guests. I'm interested to see what your answer might be. I want you to imagine a hypothetical situation where you are granted a 1-year sabbatical from your current life, during which everything's paid for, don't worry. You don't have to worry about your family, your travel expenses, where you live, what you do. So you've got this year. What do you choose to do in that year?
Good question. I don't think I've got any off the top of my head. I mean, I'm kind of already living like the life that I want to, within reason. I'm living the life that I want to be living. That I'm doing the advocacy and doing the projects that I want to do anyway. Because I'm already working more directly in the Bitcoin world. I guess if I was still in a more of a fiat job, then yeah, it would be something, go get more focused into Bitcoin. But, within the world of Bitcoin, there's all kinds of things that, could be done or could be improved. Onboarding pathways, explanation to people about why fiat currency is so bad, improving things in terms of investing in the ecosystem. Yeah, I don't know. I honestly, maybe it would be kind of like sit down and write out a book or something like that. Like maybe that would be something I could do.
I mean, we get a myriad of answers, but the best answer I would imagine is that I've asked myself the same question, and there's only a few tweaks I'd make, and I think that's often a sign that you're on the right path if that's the situation you're already in. So congratulations to you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
You beat the system currently. Well, anyway, thanks, Stephan, for your time, and I look forward to hearing you talk at, we're in El Salvador at the moment. There's the Adopting Bitcoin conference starts tomorrow, so I'll look forward to listening to you then.
Well, thank you for having me.